Good evening. My name is Nicholas Gucciardo, and today I'm going to discuss the results of my thesis and what it may mean for the relationship between international trade and voting alignment at the United Nations General Assembly. It is not an over-exaggeration to say that trade may become the key to geopolitical power in the 21st century. In a world that is highly dependent on the global supply chains, the consequences of events in smaller countries can reverberate around the globe more than ever. Better understanding the relationship between trade and the United Nations General Assembly is an urgent matter for two reasons. First, and arguably foremost, the General Assembly matters because it is the premier international deliberative body for all members of the United Nations to vote on crucial geopolitical issues. In recent years, the U.S. has begun to withdraw from international deliberative bodies such as the World Health Organization and reduce its role in global geopolitics as populist domestic politics have emphasized policies that benefit the United States first, even if it's at the expense of all other partners. Convincing large swaths of the electorate that greater international engagement is beneficial will be vital to the return of the United States as a global player. Second, this question may speak to the development of smaller countries and how their importance to larger powers may play a significant role in their export-oriented industries. If larger countries positively contribute to needed development, these smaller countries will avoid any risks to that export business. By being the largest importer for more countries means that the large economies will have leverage in dictating the political terms of these bilateral relations. However, this study is also necessary to understand whether foreign direct investment is a more effective tool for stronger voting alignment than merchandise trade. Answering all these questions may help U.S. policymakers put the United States in a stronger geopolitical position in the coming decades. To summarize this paper in a few sentences, the results of this study show that a greater dependency on the United States for a smaller country's exports will not likely lead to stronger voting alignment in the United Nations General Assembly between the United States and smaller countries in sub-Saharan Africa or the Indo-Pacific region. In a regression of the American share of the world's imports from a given smaller country on General Assembly voting alignment between the United States and that same given smaller country, controlling for time and entity fixed effects, the coefficient is small amongst countries in the Indo-Pacific region and negative in sub-Saharan Africa. However, when a variable is added that measures the U.S. share of foreign direct investment inflows into a given country, the effects of trade on General Assembly voting alignment are somewhat mitigated in both regions. As for the connection between foreign direct investment and General Assembly alignment, a greater share of foreign direct investment inflows from the United States did not necessarily lead to greater support for Washington's prerogatives at the General Assembly. Of course, this study would have not been possible without the previous contributions to the international economic literature. From the literature review, I have come up with two important conclusions that justify the need for this study. First, it is possible for powerful states to employ economic incentives to manipulate political relationships so that the United Nations can better advance the agendas of the most powerful states. Gesebner and Knudsen-McCurchin found that a stronger General Assembly voting alignment between the United States and sampled countries decreased the chances of trade preference suspensions in the U.S. generalized system of preferences. In other words, if countries that had trade preferences were to fall out of favor with the United States at the United Nations, it would likely lose business from the United States import market. Next, Kuziemko and Worker concluded that when countries are elected to the United Nations Security Council, aid from the United States increased far more than did aid from the United Nations. Furthermore, Dreher, Strum, and Vreeland found a strong relationship between the election of countries to the Security Council and participation in the International Monetary Fund programs. This literature clearly demonstrates that large countries purposely use funds they unilaterally control to push important smaller countries towards stronger alignment in the United Nations. The other important conclusion is that smaller economies can be highly vulnerable to import demand shocks by powerful countries. Bastos' analysis found that several countries in Southeast Asia have become heavily dependent on China for industry-level exports. This means that there could potentially be General Assembly disagreements that put these countries in danger of losing business from Chinese imports, if the Chinese Communist Party were to impose trade barriers on these countries. This literature confirms that smaller countries can naturally become heavily dependent on large countries for their exports, and that the trade policies of large countries can have major ramifications for the output of smaller economies. For the rest of the presentation, I'm going to discuss the conceptual framework behind my study. After that, I'm going to talk about the institutional details behind the United Nations General Assembly, the U.S. Department of State, and other organizations. Finally, I will reveal my regional results for both the set of countries in the Indo-Pacific region and the set of countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. With those results, we can then address the important relationship between trade and the United Nations General Assembly voting alignment. To better understand the idea that may influence General Assembly voting alignment, we need to understand the role that trade plays in the economy. When economists calculate a country's gross domestic product or gross national product, they always consider consumption, investment, and government expenditures. However, the focus of the study is on the net exports because they are arguably more exposed to international political turmoil than the other variables. If larger importers impose tariffs, quotas, or other punitive trade measures on exporters from smaller countries, then output Y would be affected. For many countries, this is a fact that they must reckon with because a loss in business from other countries would hurt a smaller country's domestic firms and reduce the number of exports into the output calculations. As a result, a smaller country's output would likely suffer. In addition to plummeting output and worsening trade deficits, the currencies of smaller countries could be most severely affected by punitive trade barriers. Conventional economic theory stipulates that when there is greater demand for the goods of a smaller country, greater demand for the smaller country's domestic currency will lead to a lower exchange rate and an appreciated currency, assuming ceteris paribus. After all, if the factory workers and owners are earning money from abroad, it will have to be converted to domestic currency so that they can pay taxes and consume other goods. However, if exports were to decrease, then the demand for the small country's goods would decrease, and the exchange rate for the small country's domestic currency would depreciate because there would be less workers and firms demanding the domestic currency, assuming ceteris paribus. Perhaps output would recover in the long term when the currency depreciates again, but this would present very dangerous optics for the political class of the smaller countries. In some case, this loss in output could lead to political instability and a further deterioration in output. To better illustrate this idea, let's show a visual example. On the left, we have a pie graph showing the world's imports from small country B during the first time period. As you can see, large country A has most of the world's imports from small country B. Given the assumption that the total world imports from small country B equals country B's total exports, large country A is now responsible for a significant portion of country B's total export. Therefore, large country A either improves small country B's output or prevents small country B from running a greater trade deficit if it has one. If large country A has a greater share of the world's imports from small country B, then small country B will want to avoid a political fallout because it openly opposed large country A's most pressing priorities. If large country A imposes punitive trade barriers for disagreements at the United Nations General Assembly, then the trade deficit and subsequently output of small country B would suffer significantly. However, in the second time period, we see that country A's share of the world's imports from small country B have become smaller in proportion. That may mean that the economic pressure to vote for large country A's political priorities has weakened. Instead, large country C has now become the dominant importer of small country B's goods. The research aims to study whether the change in the share of the world's imports by large country A leads to a change in voting alignment between smaller country B and large country A. We also ought to understand whether the increased import share from large country C contributes to a change in voting alignment between small country B and small country C. Now, let's talk about the institutions which have provided this study with the data we need. Two of the most important institutions for the study are the United States Department of State and the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Every year, the U.S. Department of State is mandated by law to release results on the U.S. delegation to the United Nations in reports on UN voting practices. According to these reports, there are uncontested votes, which are resolutions that are passed without a vote, and there are contested votes, which are resolutions that require a vote to pass. For both types of votes, if a country votes in the same way as the United States, it counts towards the alignment percentage. However, this study only considers contested votes because uncontested votes do not necessarily reflect the economic ability of the United States to coerce other countries to do what it wants when the smaller countries would not align with the United States in any other situation. Furthermore, the data for the main explanatory variable comes from the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development in the form of statistics on the U.S. share of the world's imports from smaller countries. From 2010 until 2019, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development has kept track of bilateral trade relations between the United States and other smaller countries. For this research, we are studying merchandise trade instead of services because the tangible merchandise is what enables consumers in the United States to enjoy cheaper goods. The United States is also an economy that is more reliant on services because it is considered an industrialized economy. In addition, other institutions help me gather information that could cause significant biases for General Assembly voting alignment. First, to capture foreign direct inflows, investment inflows from the United States to other countries, I consulted the Bureau of Economic Analysis for data pertaining to U.S. FDI inflows from 2010 to 2019. If foreign direct investment is more effective in advancing the development of smaller countries and their firms, then the firms will want to continue to have access to precious capital for their products. Second, the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, is the mechanism through which the United States provides foreign aid to other countries. If countries receive foreign aid from the United States, perhaps voting alignment would be stronger because there would be an incentive to at least continue a large unilateral cash flow from the United States. Another potentially major source of economic help for smaller countries is loan borrowing from international institutions such as the World Bank. The World Bank and other Bretton Woods institutions provide credits for smaller countries in fiscal trouble and keeps track of how much each country borrows from the World Bank and institutions. Since the World Bank and other Bretton Woods institutions are Washington-based institutions, and the literature has confirmed that the U.S. can manipulate such places, the amount of loans could also influence the General Assembly voting patterns of smaller countries. Finally, the Google Earth computer program provided information on geographical biases that could either affect trade or General Assembly alignment. With the distance tool in Google Earth, I measured the distance between Los Angeles and major cities for the Indo-Pacific set, and for the Sub-Saharan African set, distance was measured between New York City and Sub-Saharan African cities. Since this study measures the change in voting alignment and other variables between years and countries, it was found that panel data would be best for the regression equations. Furthermore, 3 tests will be conducted for the 2 models to account for a regression without fixed effects, a regression with only country fixed effects, and a regression with year fixed effects and country fixed effects. Organizing figures with panel data would create entity fixed effects to measure change between years and time fixed effects for countries. However, it is also crucial that the data is divided into 2 separate panel data sets because regional analyses would be more useful to policymakers. Even though the Indo-Pacific and Sub-Saharan African regions may be connected by commerce, their economic and political priorities may vary between the regions. Therefore, policymakers would not be able to draw substantial conclusions from the study if all 40 sampled countries were combined into one panel data set. With the literature read and the methodology determined, it is now possible to construct a regression equation that may reveal a causative relationship between the U.S. share of the world's imports from smaller countries and voting alignment between the United States and those same smaller countries. And you can already tell the log variables are being used instead of absolute measurements because U.S. policymakers would likely find changes in all variables more useful. By thoroughly understanding the trends of General Assembly voting alignment, merchandise trade, and other variables, U.S. policymakers could draft better policy to strengthen Washington's geopolitical position. So, here are the variables as follows. In equation 1, we have the dependent variable, which is the natural log of a score out of 1, that of n votes, the United States and that smaller country vote together in the same direction in the General Assembly. The first explanatory variable is the natural log of the U.S. share of the world's imports from that small country. The second explanatory variable is the natural log of the amount of foreign aid that is provided to countries by the United States in each region every year. The third explanatory variable is the natural log of the amount in IBRD and IDA credits as measured by the World Bank. The fourth explanatory variable is the natural log of distance between country cities. For the Indo-Pacific set, it's the distance between Los Angeles and mostly capital cities. And for the Sub-Saharan African set, it's the distance between New York City and mostly capital cities. Now, as for equation 2, we have the same dependent variable and the same explanatory variables, but now for that fifth explanatory variable, we are now adding the natural log of US FDI inflows into the small country in question to determine whether FDI may displace trade as the premier mechanism for gaining influence in the United Nations General Assembly. Finally, I would like to note that time-fixed and entity-fixed variables were used for every year and sampled country in the study. Now, let's turn to my results, and I'll start with the Indo-Pacific countries. After conducting 3 tests that features no fixed effects, country fixed effects, and time and country fixed effects, it could be concluded that for every 1% increase in the US share of the global imports from a given smaller country, voting alignment in the General Assembly did not change significantly. For Model 1, voting alignment changed between negative 4.2% and positive 1.1%. In Model 2, voting alignment changed between negative 4.1% and positive 1.1%. Foreign direct investment did not seem to have much of an effect on General Assembly voting alignment either, nor did it seem to have much of an effect on how the US import share affected General Assembly voting alignment. For every 1% increase in US FDI inflows, Model 2 has estimated that voting alignment changed between about 0.0% and 0.1%. As for the other variables, foreign aid and Bretton Woods loans have not appeared to have helped the United States gain greater support in the General Assembly during the last decade. For every 1% increase in foreign aid, voting alignment on average changed between negative 0.2% and positive 0.2% for Model 1, and between negative 0.2% and positive 0.1% for Model 2. For every 1% increase in IBRD or IDA credits, voting alignment changed between negative 1.7% and positive 0.2% in both models. The one major difference between the results from the first test and the third test is that because distance between a city and Los Angeles did not change during the 2010s, the distance variable was omitted. Considering this result, there's a chance that the results were coincidentally the same between the first and third tests otherwise. On the other hand, having a larger share of the world's imports clearly did not help the United States gain greater support at the General Assembly amongst sub-Saharan African countries. After completing the same 3 tests on the bilateral relationships between the United States and countries in sub-Saharan Africa, for every 1% increase in the U.S. share of a smaller country's exports, General Assembly voting alignment decreased by somewhere between 24 and 27% in both models. Foreign direct investment appears to have produced a more positive effect in sub-Saharan Africa than it has in the Indo-Pacific region. For every 1% increase in foreign direct investment, voting alignment increased by somewhere from 0.3% to 0.4%. Greater aid and loans have also not helped the United States achieve greater support in the General Assembly. For every 1% increase in foreign aid, voting alignment decreased by 6.7% to 15.9% in Model 1 and 6.4% to 15.8% in Model 2. For every 1% increase in IBRD and IDA credits, voting alignment decreased from 19% to 26% in Model 1 and between 18.7% and 25.7% in Model 2. Unlike the Indo-Pacific set, there is an omission of the distance variable for every model in all tests. Considering that the fixed effects tests produce different t-values and standard errors, it may be a coincidence that the first and third tests contain the same coefficients. Before we discuss the conclusions, we need to talk about the collinearity problems that emerged from the data processing. In the case of the log of distance variable, the regression for both sample sets seems to have mostly omitted this variable. Originally, I had thought that a closer distance to the United States would encourage a stronger voting alignment on its own because regional blocs could have had similar priorities. After all, this is the primary reason that I separated the data into two separate regional sets. Although I recognize that distance could have been more closely linked with the other explanatory variables, I did not expect that the application of the panel data fixed effects would omit the distance variable entirely. Consequently, all we can really gather from this omission is that there is too much variation from the best fitted line in the distance data for both regressions to really find a correlation or causation between distance and General Assembly voting alignment. Aside from the glaring omission, we can still reach certain conclusions. First, different significant coefficients between each region indicates that it was appropriate to separate the data into the Indo-Pacific dataset and the Sub-Saharan African dataset. In both regions, when the US had a greater share of the world's imports from smaller countries, it appears that it either weakened or did not affect General Assembly voting alignment with the United States. This effect was much more severe in Sub-Saharan Africa. Having a greater amount of FDI inflows also happened to help the United States strengthen its General Assembly voting alignment with countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. But with Indo-Pacific countries, a greater amount of FDI inflows seems to have done nothing for voting alignment. The second conclusion of the study is that the inclusion of the foreign direct investment variables appears to have somewhat mitigated the effects of the other economic variables on General Assembly voting alignment. If the effects were positive voting alignment, then they became weaker. If the effects were negative, then the inclusion of this variable made those effects even less severe. Ultimately, it does not appear that a greater share of the world's imports helps the United States gain more support at the United Nations General Assembly. Perhaps an increase in American imports from these regions may not help the United States in its pursuit of greater geopolitical power in the Indo-Pacific or Sub-Saharan African regions. Finally, future research can perhaps be dedicated towards finding the relationship between trade and General Assembly voting alignment for the other members of the Security Council's permanent 5 countries and other important powers such as Japan and India. The remaining 4 members of the Security Council P5 have reputations for large economies, powerful militaries, and outsized influences on other territories around the world. It would be useful for policymakers in each of these countries to better understand how they could use their own economic tools to pursue greater geopolitical power. Furthermore, although neither India nor Japan are P5 countries, they also have a reputation for large economies and powerful militaries. They are also both in direct competition with China, and if they want to stifle the influence of China in the Indo-Pacific region, and possibly Sub-Saharan Africa, the leaders of both countries will want to rally more General Assembly members against China. I would like to thank you for watching my presentation on trade and geopolitics. I hope that you have come away with a new perspective on the relationship between trade and the United Nations General Assembly and what it may mean for U.S. policymaking going forward.